Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 21, The Dominion of New England. Last time, we discussed the creation of the last of the Restoration colonies, Pennsylvania and Delaware. For those of you keeping count at home, that means we've officially discussed the creation of almost every one of the original 13 colonies. Only Georgia is left. Today, we're going to begin a series of 4 episodes centered around the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the people of England boldly cast off the shackles of tyranny and expelled the vile Catholic James II from the kingdom, replacing him with the good Protestant monarchs William and Mary. Or something like that. Whatever the Glorious Revolution was, it had a big impact on the colonies, sparking rebellions up and down the coast. The colonists weren't coordinating their actions or anything, and they were rebelling against different things in different colonies, but this was still one of the first big events to hit all of the colonies at the same time. Before we get to the Glorious Revolution itself, we need to set the stage a bit more by looking at the creation of the Dominion of New England, which I've been hinting at for a while. The Dominion of New England, which absorbed all the colonies of New England plus New York and New Jersey, was the high watermark of the Stuart policy of centralization and control. You'll recall that since the restoration of Charles II in 1660, England has been pursuing a policy of expansion and centralization abroad. New colonies were formed and old colonies were put on more of a leash, thanks to the provisions of the Navigation Acts, which firmly entrenched the mercantile system. The potential economic value of the colonies to the mother country was finally becoming apparent. Tobacco alone accounted for a third of the government's customs revenue. In general, these regulations favored England at the expense of the colonies, which is unsurprising considering who was writing the rules. All trade to and from Europe had to pass through England and be carried out on English vessels, raising costs for the colonists, and all the customs money being demanded cut into profits. The settlers were naturally resistant to this, and so in order to enforce the Navigation Acts, England had to take more direct control. We already heard about how they split off New Hampshire from Massachusetts and how they increased their hold on Virginia in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion. But despite all the complaints of the colonists, the mercantile system became a fixed part of English policy very quickly, and nothing could dislodge it. And nowhere did the mercantile system chafe more than in New England. When we last left New England, it was in the late 1670s in the aftermath of King Philip's War. The colonies had been devastated by the war against the Indians, but they had come out on top, and now they dominated the region even more strongly than before. New England had become a more or less mature society in a remarkably short period of time, thanks to the fact that people had migrated in family units, thus avoiding the instability of the typical frontier society. New England had social cohesion, reasonably stable governments, and a population that was expanding, both numerically and geographically. The largest of the colonies was Massachusetts, which also controlled what is now Maine. Its population was 1.5 times the size of all the other New England colonies put together. South of Massachusetts there was Plymouth, founded by the Pilgrims, Rhode Island, the anti-Puritan renegade colony, and Connecticut, which was just Massachusetts in miniature. The colonies were very independent politically. Everywhere else in America, government was largely in the hands of officials appointed either by the king or by the proprietors of that particular colony. Popular participation was in most cases limited to electing representatives to the lower house of legislature and maybe some local officials. But in New England, on the other hand, practically everyone was elected, from the town selectman all the way up to the governor himself. English control over New England was mostly nominal. If the colonies strayed too far, they risked provoking an invasion by the king, but otherwise they could pretty much do as they pleased. This, of course, conflicted with the Crown's increasing desire to centralize, to bring the colonies into line for the good of the mother country. New England was quite recalcitrant in enforcing the Navigation Acts, and I've already talked about how New England smugglers helped other colonists avoid paying customs duties. And while most of the other colonies provided exports to England, sugar, tobacco, and so on, New Englanders were more focused on becoming traders themselves. That meant that New England was competing with England economically, instead of complementing it by providing goods that England couldn't produce itself. They were competitors rather than parts of a whole, which meant that the Navigation Acts hit them particularly hard by restricting their ability to trade freely. And on top of all that, the Puritan character of New England was a direct challenge to the Anglican establishment, a weird survivor from the time before the Restoration. Officials back in England were none too happy with the way Puritans explicitly excluded everyone else from power. Rhode Island was somewhat of an exception to this, but that was the basic pattern. I won't say that a confrontation was inevitable, but clearly something was going to give. Massachusetts' sense of its own independence and England's desire for its subordination were just wholly at odds. I mean, Massachusetts even held that it wasn't subject to laws passed by Parliament. But although New England was still self-governing, it was no longer self-contained as it had been. Out of economic necessity, it had become part of the wider transatlantic trading network, and out of political necessity, it had lost some of its separation from England. For example, they found themselves turning to England to resolve disputes over land. Whose land was this? Did that land belong to Rhode Island or Massachusetts? That sort of thing. Like it or not, they were firmly within England's orbit. This was most clearly visible in New Hampshire. Now that New Hampshire was a royal province, it had a governor who was appointed by the king. Thanks to the new governor's support for both the Navigation Acts and the Anglican Church, he proved to be very unpopular, to the point of provoking a small rebellion by a former councillor. Needless to say, that couldn't have made Puritans in the rest of New England any more favorably disposed to the idea of royal government. Back in episode 13, I talked about the mostly failed attempt by Charles II to bring Massachusetts under royal control in the 1660s. The king had sent several missions to New England, but they hadn't really been able to do much in the face of local opposition. After those failures, the king's interest waned, and thus things were left much as they had been before. Well, in the 1670s, they were gearing up to try again. Previously, administration of the colonies had been rather disorganized, with no one group in charge of everything. But that was starting to change. Officials finally began constructing a proper regulatory apparatus to oversee the colonies, to centralize everything in one place. A group was formed within the Privy Council, known as the Lords of Trade and Plantations, or just the Lords of Trade for short. New England was one of their top concerns for all the reasons I've listed. More specifically, Massachusetts. It was both the largest of the colonies and easily the most stubborn. The other colonies were pretty independent, but they didn't wave it in England's face the way Massachusetts did. The Lords of Trade weren't necessarily looking to overthrow the entire New England system, but they were looking to get concessions. However, the pattern going forward will be that each overture from England will be swatted down by Massachusetts, pushing the Lords of Trade into taking stronger and stronger action to get what they want. One of the big disputes was over customs officials. Previously, the colonies had been in charge of collecting customs revenue themselves, but there was really no incentive for them to do so, and plenty of reasons not to, so for the most part they simply didn't. Thus, the king was failing to get the money he was owed. In order to fix this, in 1673, Parliament passed a bill which further extended the Navigation Acts, giving the king the right to place his own customs officials in the colonies, men who would be appointed by and accountable to him instead of to the colonial governments. Massachusetts, of course, did what it could to block all of this. The complaints against Massachusetts grew so loud that the Lords of Trade sent an agent to the colony, Edward Randolph, to investigate. Randolph's report was unsurprisingly unfavorable. The Lords of Trade presented these complaints to Massachusetts, but still the colony refused to make any real concessions. So the Lords of Trade decided that they were going to have to force a change in Massachusetts themselves. It was the only way to make them conform to His Majesty's colonial policies. Otherwise, they may as well not be under English control at all. There were even proposals to launch a naval blockade, although that didn't happen. Instead, they began an investigation into whether the colony's charter was valid. You remember the Charter of Massachusetts, right? The Massachusetts Bay Colony had originally been created by the Massachusetts Bay Company as a for-profit enterprise all the way back in the late 1620s. The company had been formed thanks to a charter granted by Charles I. But when the colony was created, they took the charter with them, which essentially dissolved the company itself and left the colony in charge of its own affairs, owing only nominal allegiance to the monarchy. The charter thus came to function as a de facto constitution for Massachusetts, and it was seen by the colonists as the thing which guaranteed their liberty and independence, even though it had originally been created to do something quite different. To the Puritans, their charter was virtually a sacred document, the bedrock of political life in the colony. Well, the Lords of Trade wanted to see whether or not this was all legal. If they could find some way in which the charter had been violated, then they could have it revoked and force Massachusetts to accept a new charter, one with the governor who was appointed by the crown rather than elected. But before they went that far, they made a more conciliatory offer. They tried to see if they could get Massachusetts to accept a supplemental charter, which would modify the original one, and thus bring the colony into line with English policy. That would be a big change, but less dramatic than throwing out the whole charter. However, that proposal met the same stonewalling that everything else did. Massachusetts would just send representatives to England with instructions to agree to nothing and to delay as much as humanly possible. The Lords of Trade had inaccurately believed that a large number of settlers in New England were hostile to the Puritan regime, and that their interference would be welcome, but they were slowly realizing that the opposite was true. The Puritans remained Puritan, and they were dedicated to their charter. There was no way for the Lords to get what they wanted without a fight. They also tried to separate Maine from Massachusetts. The heirs to the founders of Maine were pressing a claim against Massachusetts, saying that the territory belonged to them, and that Massachusetts had unrightfully usurped their position. The Crown, of course, supported this as a way to weaken Massachusetts, but it didn't work. Agents from the colony secretly bought the charter for Maine from those heirs, right out from under the government's nose. England was furious, but now that Massachusetts clearly owned Maine, there wasn't much they could legally do about it. And in fact, Maine would remain part of Massachusetts until 1820, although it was now geographically separated from the rest of the colony by New Hampshire. Anyway, due to complications in England, further action against the charter was delayed for several years, leaving Massachusetts time to stew in its anxiety. Needless to say, after the twin shocks of King Philip's War and the threat to their cherished charter, the mood was tense. On top of that, a fire destroyed a good portion of Boston in 1679. In the meantime, Edward Randolph was sent back to Massachusetts, this time as a customs officer, but officials there did everything to make his job impossible. They passed their own trade laws, which contradicted the Navigation Acts by setting up their own administration to regulate exports. Some of Randolph's deputies were thrown in prison. The governor, John Leverett, refused to swear that he would uphold the Navigation Acts as demanded by the Lords of Trade. However, this sort of hardline attitude wasn't actually universally supported. Do you remember the factions in Massachusetts I talked about in episode 13? On one side you had the Commonwealth faction, which favored near-total independence, and on the other side you had the Moderate faction, which preferred a conciliatory approach to England. Well, those factions were back, now that Massachusetts' status was once again in question. The issues at stake were broader than just one's attitude towards England, however. The real question was, what sort of society would Massachusetts become? Would it remain a Puritan-dominated democracy/oligarchy/theocracy, or would it become a more normal English colony, more accepting of religious diversity and fully integrated into the empire through trade? Disenfranchised non-Puritans tended to be moderates, of course, as did merchants, who, after all, actually had to deal with England regularly. A few men like that even supported the imposition of a royal government. These kinds of men also tended to support replacing religious restrictions on voting with property restrictions. Basically, the moderates wanted to reduce New England's distinctiveness in a number of ways. But as before, the hardline Commonwealth faction was probably the most popular, certainly among those who had voting rights. These men were Puritans, farmers, those with a more local perspective on things. Governor Leverett was from the Commonwealth faction, as was most of the government. However, Governor Leverett died in 1679. His successor, Simon Bradstreet, was more conciliatory, and so the lower house of the General Court became the leaders of the Commonwealth faction. They continued the fight against Edward Randolph. Randolph, for his part, sent a stream of letters back to England, telling the Lords of Trade of the colonists' horrible intransigence and recommending numerous detailed plans for reform, many of which were later taken up. So the 1670s came and went without any actual action being taken against Massachusetts or its charter, but that was just delaying the inevitable. As it became clear that changes were coming, the mood of the colony turned even further against compromise. Resistance was stiffened by the clergy, who associated the colony's charter with the divine will, more or less, making the attacks on it tantamount to sacrilege. David S. Lovejoy relates the story of one town meeting in Boston. Quote, "When asked by Samuel Noel, a magistrate who presided, for a show of hands of those who favored giving up the charter, none responded. Then, holding up both hands, one freeman burst out, 'The Lord be praised.' At this point, after the vote had been decided, Increase Mather rose and exhorted the freemen about Jephthah, Naboth, David, and then Ahab for good measure. If they submitted now, he told them, their children would live to curse them." End quote. These exhortations worked. In the elections of 1684, the moderate faction garnered relatively little support, and 3 moderate magistrates lost altogether, which was unusual, although the moderate Governor Bradstreet kept his position. Meanwhile in England, the Lords of Trade were becoming more and more grandiose in their planning. It was no longer enough to just install a royal governor in Massachusetts. Now they were thinking of something much bigger. They had decided to combine all of the New England colonies into one bigger colony, which would be directly ruled by an appointed governor. This would both curb Puritan power as well as strengthen the defenses of the region, since the separate colonies had generally been poor at cooperation, even in the face of mutual threats. And it would be considerably cheaper as well, since fewer officials would be required. This hadn't been their initial plan, but they'd come to the conclusion it was necessary. Massachusetts, secure in its righteousness and secure in its charter, simply refused to budge an inch. So finally, in the early 1680s, the Crown took real action against the charter. They couldn't just revoke it by fiat, though. According to English law, the charter was seen as private property, and so to revoke it they had to challenge it in court. To do otherwise would have been seen as lawless and dangerous. But the case against the charter went very quickly. In fact, there was hardly a trial at all. The attorneys representing Massachusetts failed to enter a plea at the required time, despite being given a delay, and so, just like that, the charter was officially annulled in late 1684, without Massachusetts even contesting the case. According to the judge presiding over the hearings, Massachusetts was, quote, a company of rebels. However, just a few months later, King Charles died, which briefly delayed further action. The throne passed to his brother, James II. James was even more in favor of royal power than his brother had been, both at home and in the colonies. He was hoping to emulate the absolutist rule of Louis XIV in France. So when it came time to figure out what to do with Massachusetts and New England, the answer was certainly going to be to centralize and to take power back from the people. He was more than ready to back the Lords of Trade's plan for consolidation. This was part of a larger plan to reorganize English government. James was launching an attack on the Charter of London, for instance, trying to remold local government into something much more loyal to him, and to shut down bastions of resistance to his rule. He also attacked the charters of proprietary provinces like Maryland, to put them under direct royal control as well. Bringing the Puritans to heel was a natural part of all this. So in addition to the Charter of Massachusetts, the Crown also challenged the charters of Rhode Island and Connecticut. Plymouth had never actually had a charter, while New Hampshire was a royal province already, so there was no need to do anything about those two. It took a bit of time, but by October 1687, all of those colonies had been incorporated into the brand new Dominion of New England without a fight. James took a personal interest in the creation of the Dominion, pushing it in a more authoritarian, less representative direction. When time came to craft a constitution for the Dominion, the Lords of Trade had assumed that it would be given the standard colonial sort of government of governor/council/assembly. However, James personally overruled them, demanding that there be no representative assembly. Don't forget he had tried to govern New York without an assembly for as long as possible. So instead there would just be a governor and a 30-man council, all of whom were to be appointed rather than elected. All legislation they passed required the approval of the king. Realistically, abolishing or at least crippling the assembly was the only way royal officials were going to get anything done. An elective assembly would have been controlled by Puritans, who had of course proved themselves more than willing to block actions by the king. For that matter, Puritan supremacy was to be totally abolished as well, with the removal of religious restrictions on voting, and a guarantee of religious tolerance. And on top of all that, Anglicanism was to be favored when possible at the expense of Puritanism. This was a big leap from the earlier plans to reorganize Massachusetts. The Lords of Trade had kept in mind the possibility of local resistance, so their plans had been much more modest. Even Edmund Randolph, who had been tirelessly advocating for big changes in New England, thought that this was going too far. The goal, in his view, should have been to take control of New England, not to destroy its institutions. This was just going to provoke the colonists for no good reason. But the king had his way in the end, and so the Dominion came into existence, without an assembly. It took a little while for things to get settled, but within a year of taking power, James appointed Edmund Andros as governor of the Dominion. This was another move sure to lead to trouble with the Puritans. You remember Andros, right? From 4 episodes ago? He was the former governor of New York who'd had the governor of East Jersey beaten and kidnapped. But despite that little incident, and despite his unpopularity with the colonists, he still had James's favor. Andros was a former soldier and certainly no Puritan, and certainly not very tactful. In the words of William Penn, he was, quote, over-eager and too pressing in execution of his power when provoked. And now he was being sent to govern some of the most prickly, rigid people in the whole wide world. I'd wish him good luck, but I already know he won't have it. Word was sent to Boston of all these changes, and a temporary government for Massachusetts was set up and placed in the hands of the moderate faction until Andros arrived. Seeing no better alternatives, the colonists gloomily submitted. The General Court met for apparently the last time. Was this not, along with King Philip's War, a divine punishment for their sins and their lassitude? Andros finally arrived in December 1686, along with 60 soldiers, and he got to work in his high-handed style. A surprising number of colonists were willing to cooperate with the new government. There wasn't any sort of massive resistance at first. According to Richard R. Johnson, quote, 22 of the 30 New Englanders who sat on the Dominion Council had formerly served as magistrates or colony officials. Of those nominated to the council, only 3, from Massachusetts, refused to serve. End quote. Almost nobody was happy with the creation of the Dominion, but clearly a lot of men, those from the moderate faction, were willing to make do. The moderates had sensed the shift in English policy and how serious it was, and they'd rather New England bend than be broken. They also tended to be from the second generation of settlers, while the hardline Commonwealth faction, or at least their leaders, tended to come from the original generation, now quite old. In fact, 2 of the members of the council were grandsons of John Winthrop, who had been governor of Massachusetts for most of its first 2 decades. No doubt the younger generation, having lived much of their lives after the Restoration, had a much different view of what English politics was like than their parents, who had lived through the English Civil War. I should point out that even among younger Puritans, compromise was still unpopular, and collaborators with Andros's government were denounced both in public and at the pulpit. And frankly, Andros did nothing to change anyone's mind. Andros had the council to advise him, but in practice he acted on his own, not really taking anyone else's interests into account. The men he did listen to were all outsiders. As a result, he soon had basically no allies in the colony. Even those moderates who might be somewhat favorably disposed to the Dominion found that it was costing them money for no particular benefit. In fact, things seemed to be getting worse on almost every front. The schools suffered from a lack of funds, the court system was made more expensive and more corrupt, the navigation acts were thoroughly enforced, which rather wrecked the economy for a while. Puritan churches no longer received public funds, and Anglicans were given a disproportionate number of offices. Andros also made extremely aggressive changes to how land was distributed. You'll recall that in New England it was traditionally the individual towns which were in charge of land distribution. If you wanted to move to a town and buy a farm, you needed the permission of the townsmen. This decentralization had to go. Land was both a source of local independence and a potential source of revenue for the crown. Andros thus claimed that the revocation of the charters meant that every purchase of land which had been made under those charters was now invalid, and that all land in New England now reverted to the king. In other words, no one owned any of the land they thought they did. Now, Andros didn't actually plan to take everyone's land, he just wanted to change the legal basis on which they owned it. But this sort of action was seen as a huge threat by everyone for obvious reasons. All of a sudden you no longer had a right to land which had been in your family for a generation. Even if you probably would be able to get a new title, now everything was much more uncertain. You could hardly have designed a policy to be more upsetting to the colonists. But the first big outburst of discontent was actually due to taxation. Overall tax rates hadn't necessarily gone up, but the new taxes were poorly designed and hit some groups disproportionately hard. That was bad enough, but the real problem was that these taxes were being levied without the approval of an elected assembly, which the New Englanders saw as a crystal clear violation of their rights as Englishmen. Did Magna Carta's guarantee of no taxation without the approval of a legislature not apply to the colonies? The colonists certainly thought it did. This was a noteworthy shift in rhetoric. Whereas before they had looked to their charter for defense, now they were citing the laws of England, which they had previously held themselves to be more or less exempt from. So the revocation of the charter was already having an impact on how New Englanders thought of themselves. Before they were Puritans, now they were Englishmen. Anyway, when the time came to pay these new taxes, many towns in Essex County refused, sometimes at the urging of their ministers. The townsmen simply didn't appoint any tax collectors to collect the taxes. In response, Andros summoned the instigators to Boston and had some of them imprisoned. Most of these selectmen submitted within a few days, but a few went to trial and were convicted and heavily fined. That was enough to suppress the protests for now. Andros had shown that he was willing to get his way by force. Partly as a result of this tax revolt, he then proceeded to put strict limits on the independence of town governments. Town meetings could now only be held once a year, and the selectmen who were chosen by those town meetings were placed under centralized supervision. Other than these annual meetings, the townsmen were totally prohibited from assembling. This, as much as the elimination of the general court, was a huge restriction on traditional New England self-government. New England had suddenly gone from electing everyone to electing almost no one. To the extent that New Englanders were involved in their government, it was just through the 30 councilmen, all of whom came from a minority faction, and most of whom were economic elites looking out for their own interests, rather than the interests of New England as a whole. Some were merchants who wanted to prevent trade from being taxed, others were major landowners who wanted to keep land from being taxed. That sort of thing. Very oligarchical. But most of the Dominion's activities were concentrated within Massachusetts itself, and to a lesser extent within Plymouth, simply because that's where the people were, and because the outlying parts of New England were just too far away to be closely monitored. At least Rhode Island was freed from the domineering behavior of its Puritan neighbors for a while. But although New England itself was already almost too large to be centrally governed, the Dominion of New England was about to get even bigger. In March 1688, King James ordered that New York and New Jersey be added to the Dominion, creating a 600-mile-long mega-colony. Partly this was for reasons of defense against the growing French menace. New England and the Middle Colonies had a history of failing to cooperate militarily, given their different cultures and their history of border disputes. The transfer of power in New York went smoothly, and there was, in general, less angst about the whole thing than in New England. When Andros went on a tour of the Dominion's new additions, he was greeted warmly. However, the Dominion was now so large that it couldn't in practice be governed by one man. So Andros remained governor in Boston while he appointed a deputy governor, Francis Nicholson, to rule from New York. This sort of halfway decentralization was seen as okay, so long as military cooperation was guaranteed, since that was the whole point. There may have even been some further notion to consolidate the southern colonies into another big dominion, but if so, the plan never got far. Along with all the other big plans James had for his realm, it was swept away, thanks to a sudden revolution. That will be the subject of our next episode. Next time we'll begin the story of the Glorious Revolution itself, and how it led to further upheavals in the American colonies, especially in the Dominion. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.